How China Learned to Build Everything, the Deal That Gave China the Future. On the 12th of November 1994, a private jet touched down in Beijing through a lid of gray winter smog. Inside were executives with polished shoes and starving quarterly targets. We think China rose because it worked harder or because politicians willed it into existence. But the real engine was quieter, the ledger, the balance sheet, and a global obsession with growth over control. They didn't conquer factories with tanks. They acquired them with contracts. They didn't win by force. They won by turning Western capitalism into a self-checkout lane for industrial knowledge. This story isn't about flags. It's about bankruptcy fears, insolvency nightmares, and a world that traded blueprints for revenue. Picture the boardroom that day like a casino, only the chips were patents. A Western CEO stared at a market map like it was a treasure chart. China was the glittering island where every consumer product had 1 billion possible buyers. The executive didn't see a country. He saw a sales funnel. Now imagine the other side of the table. The men across from him didn't talk like gamblers. They talked like accountants. They spoke in percentages, ownership caps, and timelines. They weren't selling access to customers. They were selling a future seat inside the factory itself. This is the deal that gave China the future, not because it was magical, because it was structured, because it was priced, because it was paid for with someone else's desperation. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. At the peak of the illusion, the West wore confidence like armor. In the 1990s, America and Europe looked like permanent winners. Their airports gleamed. Their highways stretched like veins across continents. Their factories were cathedrals of steel, humming like disciplined gods. Their brands were global passports. A German logo on a hood meant precision. A Japanese chip meant reliability. An American operating system meant dominance. Their parades were not military. They were product launches. China, on the outside, looked like a workshop with the lights off. A place for assembly lines and cheap labor. A place that could copy but never design. That was the fairy tale told in annual reports and TV interviews. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting. Not China's foundation, the West's, because mature markets don't grow forever. They plateau, they suffocate. And when growth suffocates, executives panic. The sales charts in Detroit and Stuttgart flatten like dead heart monitors. Competition got brutal. Margins got thinner. Wall Street demanded miracles on a calendar. And miracles don't come from saturated suburbs. So the gaze turned east. China wasn't just a market. It was a lifeline. And lifelines make people sign things they shouldn't. Let that number sink in. One contract can outweigh a decade of caution. Here's the trap, and it's simple. China didn't need to steal first. It let others deliver. The bait was access to scale. The hook was the joint structure, the partnership that looked cooperative. But it behaved like a machine for learning. Think of debt as a monster, because that's how it hunts. It whispers in earnings calls. It claws at stock prices. It breathes down the neck of CEOs who fear missing guidance by a single cent. Western companies were addicted to expansion like sugar. Every board meeting needed a new growth story. Every investor deck needed a new frontier. China became the drug. And like all drugs, it came with a price. The antagonist in this story isn't a general. It's the market force, the cold hand of shareholders. the bondholders who punish stagnation, the spreadsheet that turns patience into a liability. China understood that addiction. It treated Western urgency like collateral. If you want the market, you must localize. If you localize, you must partner. If you partner, you must transfer. That's not ideology. That's leverage. And leverage is just physics applied to money. The heavier side of the deal always moves the lighter one. China had the heavier weight, access to a massive demand pool. So the contracts arrived dressed like opportunity. They sounded polite. They smiled in conference photos. But inside the clauses were teeth. Ownership caps, shared tooling, shared process, shared training, shared supplier maps. And the executives signed because the quarter was burning. The ledger was hungry. They needed revenue now, not safety later. The future is easy to sell when you discount it. The descent started quietly, and that's what makes it dangerous. In 1978, China began reopening the doors to foreign capital. By 1984, the first big industrial courtships were already happening. The dates mattered less than the rhythm. Invite, restrict, absorb, repeat. A Western firm would arrive with machines, engineers, and methods. The local partner would arrive with permits, labor, and political protection. They would meet in the middle at 50-50, a marriage where one spouse wanted love and the other wanted the recipe. Numbers do the talking here. $1 billion Australian factory isn't just concrete. It's embedded knowledge. It's how you calibrate a press. It's how you train a foreman. It's the choreography of parts arriving on time. The first phase was imitation by proximity. Chinese engineers watched. They wrote notes. They mapped every failure mode. They learned what tolerance meant when a bolt either holds or kills. The second phase was imitation by supply chain. You can't build everything without vendors. So vendor networks were nurtured like gardens. A Western firm demanded a part. A Chinese supplier learned to make it, then learned to make it cheaper, then learned to make it better. The third phase was imitation by iteration. Once you can build the thing, you start changing it. You shave cost, you add features, you compress timelines. You don't just copy the product. You copy the learning curve. By the early 1990s, Western firms were shipping more than goods into China. They were shipping habits, lean management, quality audits, Six Sigma rituals, maintenance schedules. Each process was another page torn from the textbook. By 1997, Asia was hit by a financial crisis that taught everyone a brutal truth. Cash flow outranks pride. Companies that once refused risk began negotiating like beggars. China watched this carefully. It learned that fear makes technology portable. By 2001, China entered the global trading system with the confidence of a country that had done the math. The world saw cheaper products. China saw an even cheaper thing. An education subsidized by foreign impatience. Let's put hard numbers on the emotion. Imagine a multinational projecting $5 billion in China revenue by 2005. That projection becomes oxygen. The stock price starts inhaling it. If the deal fails, the share price chokes. So the company signs, it agrees to localize tools. It trains local teams. It documents the process. The foreign side calls it market entry. The Chinese side calls it capability. The rule of three hits like a hammer. The profits looked real. The dependencies grew deeper. The knowledge transfer became normal. And then the exit became impossible. The gold was gone. The credit was frozen. The alternatives had turned away. And still, the contracts kept getting signed because nobody wanted to be the first to leave the casino. Here's the part that feels like noir, the city at night, the factory lights, the paperwork in a briefcase. The real crime isn't loud. It's clerical. It happens when someone stamps a document and calls it strategy. A Western executive might say, "We'll keep the crown jewels," but factories don't work that way. If you bring a product, you bring its ecosystem. If you build locally, you teach locally. The crown jewels end up on the table, one necessary concession at a time. And China didn't need every secret. It needed enough. Enough to build a domestic base. Enough to compete. Enough to survive without you. That was the plan from the beginning, written in the margins of the ledger. Then came the smoking gun moment. Not a heist, not a hack, a meeting, a negotiation where the language was clean and the outcome was violent. Picture a conference room in the late 1990s, heavy with cigarettes and quiet threat. A foreign delegation wants majority control. The answer is a soft no. They want to protect IP. The answer is a softer no. The brutal reality is paraphrased like this: you can sell here, but you can't own here. And beneath that, you can profit now, but you will train your replacement. That's foreclosure language, except the house being seized is your advantage. It's a liquidation sale in slow motion. Instead of auctioning machines, you auction time. You trade future margin for present volume. You exchange sovereignty over your own technology for a line item called China growth. Think about the scale of that. A single clause can redirect the destiny of an industry. A single partnership can reproduce a factory culture. And once culture moves, you can't recall it like defective inventory. By 2008, the world stumbled into a financial crisis that turned arrogance into ash. Credit tightened. Demand dropped. Western firms needed cost cuts and new markets at the same time. China, holding cash and confidence, became even more attractive. This is where the ledger becomes a weapon. When you're near insolvency, you don't negotiate from strength. You negotiate from survival, and survival makes you accept terms you would have mocked a decade earlier. Then, somewhere around 2010, the mood shifted. Chinese firms didn't just want to supply. They wanted to brand. They didn't just want to build components. They wanted to own platforms. They didn't just want to assemble phones. They wanted to define the next ones. The West noticed, but late? It's always late because the West measures danger in quarterly units. But industrial strategy measures danger in decades. China played decades. The West played quarters. Now the climax, the default. Not a country defaulting on bonds. A company defaulting on control. A whole system defaulting on its own advantage. The moment the money runs out isn't when cash hits zero. It's when leverage hits zero. When a foreign company realizes it cannot threaten to leave, because leaving destroys its balance sheet. The factory is sunk cost. The supply chain is embedded. The revenue is baked into forecasts. Pulling out means admitting the growth story was borrowed, and that admission can trigger a shareholder stampede, so the company stays. And every year it stays, it trains more managers. It localizes more tooling. It shares more suppliers. It becomes a teacher with no salary and no exit. Social consequences follow. because economics always bleeds into society. Workers in the West feel the slow amputation of manufacturing jobs. Towns that once lived on machining and stamping start living on debt and opioids. The loss is quiet. Then it's permanent. On the other side, China's cities swell with migrants chasing factory wages. The lights never shut off. The production schedule becomes a religion. People trade youth for overtime, and the country trades overtime for capability. This is where you need to hear the line clearly. Sovereignty is solvency. If you can't control your productive core, you don't control your future. You become dependent, even if you still feel rich. China's future wasn't gifted by fate. It was financed by someone else's impatience. The West didn't lose because it lacked genius. It lost because it treated industrial knowledge like a depreciating asset. And like all bad accounting, the bill arrived later. When Chinese competitors emerged, they didn't appear like aliens. They looked familiar because they were shaped inside the same classrooms. Joint factories, supplier networks, shared designs, shared audits. Then the world saw the next phase. Scale as a weapon. China didn't always need the most advanced tech. It needed enough tech, multiplied. Millions of units, billions of components. The learning curve becomes a cliff when you produce at that volume. A new kind of power emerges. The ability to make everything, everywhere, all at once. Not just cars or phones. Batteries, drones, cameras, rail systems, solar panels, machine tools, industrial robots. The world starts relying on a single workshop for the modern lifestyle. That reliance is the new chain. Not made of iron, made of lead times, made of supplier concentration, made of shipping lanes. A blockade of components can be more devastating than a blockade of fuel. And now comes the generational aftermath, because mistakes like this don't end with one administration. They linger. They shape policy, culture, and paranoia for decades. By the 2010s, governments began waking up like a detective at dawn, staring at a crime scene they funded. They asked how supply chains became brittle. They asked why industrial capacity vanished. They asked why critical components had one address. The answer was the same in every file, the ledger. Decisions made to satisfy growth targets. Trade-offs approved for stock price stability. Risk dismissed because the next quarter mattered more than the next decade. It takes generations to rebuild what you outsource. You can't conjure a tool and die workforce overnight. You can't rebuild supplier ecosystems with slogans. You can't reverse an industrial migration with speeches. And the scars show up in policy, export controls, tariffs, reshoring plans, subsidies, technology restrictions, alliance pressure. The world begins to split into competing systems because trust is expensive. The last check in this story isn't literal, but it might as well be. It's paid in lost resilience. It's paid in strategic dependence. It's paid every time a nation realizes it can't produce what it needs under pressure. By 2025, the conversation isn't just about jobs. It's about national security disguised as procurement. It's about chips, batteries, and machine tools. It's about who controls the physical ability to build the future. And if you're wondering where this ends, look at the pattern. When a nation controls manufacturing, it controls options. It controls speed. It controls the next invention's price. It can starve rivals without firing a shot. The West once believed trade would soften everything. That commerce would civilize everyone into saneness. But commerce doesn't civilize. Commerce optimizes. It seeks cost, scale, and leverage has no morals. So here's the lesson, the one you should keep like a pocket knife. When someone offers you scale, ask what they want in exchange. When someone offers you access, ask what they're absorbing while you celebrate. Because history isn't decided by speeches or flags. It's decided by who controls the ledger, the factory, and the resource pipeline that feeds them. If you want to stay ahead of the people still watching history like a sports game, subscribe to the channel. Because the next surprise won't be a warhead. It'll be a shortage. It'll be a clause. It'll be a balance sheet turning red.